and welcome to Geraumt, your podcast for environmental graphic design. My name is Christian Lunger. I'm a service designer and information designer. And today, from my point of view, I have somebody very special, not only because of his profession, but as well because of his location. He's sitting in Tel Aviv right now, and we will talk about conversation design. It's Jason F. Gilbert. The F stands for Frederick, and he's a award-winning conversational designer, and he's already designed a lot of quite famous chatbots. He has already worked on a companionship bot for the elderly, and is presently working for Intuition Robotics. And I'm very happy that you found some time to talk to us. Especially as an information designer, for me, it's quite interesting because most of our work is based around designing visual information. So it's really great to talk to somebody from this new field of conversation design who does a lot of work regarding voice. So, Jason, thanks for your time and welcome to our podcast. How
Well,
are you?
thank you for having me, Christian. It's wonderful to be here all the way from sunny Tel Aviv. And yes, I am a character designer, which is sort of a subset of conversation design. And it's really a position that doesn't really exist anywhere else. The only other character designers that I see online are ones that actually can draw and illustrate, and I can barely draw stick figures. So my character design is in the persona and the personality and the dialogue and in ultimately the personality of the virtual assistant, chatbot, voice bot. So yeah, that's me.
So actually, you give the chatbot his or her or in between identity. I've read an article where you talked about Anna, that is actually a transgender a bot. That was quite an interest. That was quite interesting as well.
It's funny because the reason she's trans is because when I inherited, I started Anna in 2016, and I inherited a chatbot named Alan. Alan was worked on for about 10 years by Yaki Dunitz, who's the CEO of Coco Hub. And he sort of got tired of working on Alan. And in 2016, I took over. And as part of the overhaul that I did in creating and crafting the persona, I decided to turn Alan into Anna. Much in the same way, perhaps, that Alan Turing, which the character was based on, would have possibly transitioned to a female had he not been chemically castrated by the British. So there was sort of an underlying theme there of the trans. It's not really trans because obviously it doesn't. He or she doesn't really have a gender. It's what we assign to it. But
Mhm.
Anna identified as a trans robot. So
So when I said conversation designer, you said you're a character designer. What makes the character so important in designing a chatbot or a voice assistant?
that's a
What's it?
great question. It's a great question. I think a lot of people are starting to understand now why it's important. Whereas in the past, mostly the people that developed the character and the dialogues of the chatbot were developers, and all the human computer interaction sounded very much robotic. And the reason why we give or we try to give a personality to a chatbot or to a virtual assistant in a lot of ways is to help us with certain messages. For instance, an error message. A lot of times the technology is very limited and the chatbot won't be able to give an answer. It doesn't match. It doesn't have an answer for what the user says. And a lot of chatbots will say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Could you rephrase that? I'm sorry. Let me hand you off to a human." And I always felt that that was very robotic. And so part of crafting a personality is giving them a backstory, which would explain why they wouldn't have an answer to that question. And so let me explain. I created a virtual assistant named Artie for a company called InPerson, which is a predecessor to Coco Hub. And one of the things about Artie, who was the virtual assistant, was that it was his first day on the job, and that's what his backstory was. And so every time he made a mistake, he would say, "Ah, geez, it's my first day on the job. I really hope you don't hold it against me and tell my boss." And none of the users would get upset with him because it wasn't that he was saying anything really different than "I'm sorry, I don't have an answer." But because it was in his character, and everyone can relate to someone being, the first day on the job, you don't really know your way around, you're going to make some mistakes. So in this case, the personality and the backstory of the bot helped us craft the error messages. It also helps with empathy. A robot that doesn't have a personality, it's very hard to convey empathy. It's very hard to convey empathy in general. Even
Hmm.
as humans, sometimes I have trouble conveying empathy. Just ask my wife. But robots are especially so, because people are saying, well, you don't have feelings. How can you feel empathy? And it's tricky because when we want to create experiences that are empathetic, especially when we're talking about companionship, we're talking about loneliness, you, the chatbot needs to come across as empathetic, and that can be crafted and built in the personality of the chatbot.
Hmm.
Meaning, if you give a good backstory, which would explain why they would be empathetic, then the user is more willing to accept it. I've found over the years.
Is there, I mean, the backstory from my point of view is one aspect where you can actually, make a difference in the empathy, as you mentioned it, in understanding, bringing a certain amount of understanding to the table. Is there I mean, where else do we recognize personality? I'm thinking about, can you, I mean, when you talk to somebody, at least you think you get a feeling for somebody's personality or somebody's character, or like a stereotype that you have basically from somebody else. You build up stereotypes. How is that when you have to work with written conversations? Is there a difference between in the character design between dialogues in written or in voice conversations?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of conversation designers make is they think that they can design one experience for all mediums, meaning you can design one experience for Facebook Messenger or Discord or whatever, and the same experience can be then repurposed for Amazon Alexa or Google Home. It's not the case. Each medium requires a specific language that is unique to that medium. For instance, in text, it's really, really difficult to establish a character's voice, because a lot of times in text you don't have the intonation, you don't know if it's being sarcastic sometimes.
Hmm.
So a lot of times, what we would do is use other devices like capitalization of certain words. Uh, for instance, we did a chatbot of Dolly Parton. Do you remember Dolly Parton, the
Yes.
singer, the country singer? Well, she had a bot in 2019 that was sort of an Easter egg hunt, and she uses a lot of emojis in her everyday talk. So we tried to mirror her personality by using the emojis that she would use in the chats that she would send. So the idea in text is to try to create and form a sort of voice with just the elements that you have in text. In voice, you can have SSML, you can start you can, with the prosody, you can do a lot of different effects. You can use a real voice artist, which makes it even more immersive versus the text to speech. So there's a lot of things you can do in voice that you can't do in text. And in voice, obviously, you want it to be a lot shorter. So you need to make sure that the interactions are much, much shorter, because people won't have the patience to sit and listen to a chatbot or
Hmm.
voice bot read off a monologue. And if you've tried any of the Amazon Alexa skills, 90% of them, I'm sad to say, are all just basically radio show monologues where the user is often forgotten.
Hmm.
So,
I mean, there's so many questions I have on that. I tried to get some structure in it. The first one, when you mentioned Dolly Parton and the emojis, she kind of was used to using, and you tried to mirror that. Um, what would you say is the state of the art for a chatbot or a voice assistant to actually learn, not just to repeat, basically use the same emojis she would use, but what about the situations where the bot would have to decide what would be a new emoji? Is there a present state of art regarding this kind of technology? Like
yeah, yeah,
developing
yeah.
the character, like in a good film, in a good series, or a good book?
Well, I don't think the technology is quite there yet. I've seen some promising things from GPT 3, which is the latest OpenAI project that is generative. It generates text. But for the most part, most of the best chatbots in the world today are still heavily reliant on rules, on the rules based, meaning they pattern match. So if you're asking me whether there's a chance that the bot will learn to act like Dolly Parton, I don't think that's the case currently. I'm hoping that in the future, in the near future, that will be the case. But at the moment, it's really a lot of manual labor in trying to mimic the voice by writing the lines and having a bot master who's in charge of writing the scripts for most of the chatbots. And a lot of the AI or the magic happens in the dialogue management and in the context and in being able to understand where in the conversation the user is and get them on the right direction in terms of contextually giving them the right answer. I think that's where AI is improving at the moment.
Hmm. Um, Regarding, so that means if you write a character, you have to write the dialogues as well as they would speak it, or well, in the case of a voice assistant, as they actually speak it or would speak it if they would be on the telephone. So does that mean all the dialogues have to be written beforehand, or is there some kind of learning, AI based learning regarding the, maybe not the character but the content at least?
Not that I've come across. I would love that. That would make my life a lot easier. I got to be honest with you. It would
Hmm.
save me a lot of effort if that were the case. But I think I would also probably be out of a job. So I don't know if I'm too eager for that to happen just yet. But no, it's just, it's right now, it's conversation designers crafting sentence by sentence, crafting conversations. And one of the things to remember here is that when you craft a conversation, especially on text, a lot of people on text ask me, well, do I use proper punctuation? What if the character speaks with, is illiterate and doesn't know how to, and makes mistakes? Do I replicate that?
Hmm.
And I think that's where it starts getting very interesting because once you start replicating the person into the bot, once you start using their language, it becomes authentic.
Hmm.
So, for instance, we did a chatbot a few years ago for a movie called Cars. I don't know if it's a Disney movie called Cars,
Hmm.
and
I know it.
yeah, yeah. And there's a character in there called Miss Fritter, and she has it's Cars 3. Actually, I don't even think it's Cars 1. And Miss Fritter, we did a bot for Miss Fritter, and she was a Southern lady who had made a lot of mistakes and talked like a Southern lady, and we had to sort of try and replicate that in the text. So we used a lot of words that were capitalized. She used a lot of emojis. She sent a lot of gifs, and the idea is to mimic that language of the person in the bot. Now, I did an Einstein chatbot, an Albert Einstein for National Geographic, and that was a challenge too. How do I get Albert Einstein's unique voice on text? And now, right now, I just recently saw that they had an Einstein virtual character, a actual like a robotic type thing that they just released. I'm not sure who it was. It might be Unique who did it, and that was one of the biggest challenges. And it's we won a Webby for that in 2018,
Hmm.
and with Einstein, it was tremendously difficult because with Einstein I'm not that smart. I admit it, and I had to design the character and the responses for possibly the world's smartest human that ever lived. So how do you go about doing that? And also, I might add, I don't know anything about physics really, so that was a big issue because Einstein obviously knew a thing or two about physics. Um, so one of the ways I got around that was that I decided that in this case, Albert Einstein wouldn't be interested in talking to users about physics. He would want to talk to them about his love life. He would want to talk to them about his wife Mileva, about his children, about problems that he's having at home. Because let's face it, if you and I don't know about you, Christian, but if I had a conversation with Einstein, he started talking physics, I would be lost within about 20 seconds. But I can relate to Einstein on a personal level. I can relate to him when he talks about his wife or the fact that he fell in love with, his secretary. and all these things. I didn't fall in love with my secretary. I don't actually even have a
Mhm.
secretary. So if my wife is listening to this, honey, I did not fall in love with the secretary. Um, those are the challenges that we face as character designers and conversation designers: is how do we create an authentic version that the audience, the users, uh, sort of get immersed in and are not reminded that they're talking to a robot
Yeah,
or a
I
chatbot.
think the question you asked me, if I would talk about physics to Einstein, I probably wouldn't, because most of the things I wouldn't understand either. I think the interesting thing is from the user's point of view. If, am I somebody who would? Am I kind of in the role of talking to Einstein with an like as you said, probably from an entertainment point of perspective, I'd rather go into the personal stuff, things that makes him relatable to me. If I'd be a physics student interacting with the chatbot, I'd probably go into the physics things as well. So it's probably again the user who decides what kind of information would make a bot useful. And I'm not sure even sure if, I mean, he has both characters. He probably has the deep thinking in physics as well as the personal Einstein. So,
Which is, it's interesting because we did have quite a few physics professors and physics students
mhm,
come and talk to him. And we did have specific paths and dialogues and conversations for those people that were interested in only in the physics.
yeah,
Um, and one of the things that I've learned over the years is I use the limitations of the technology to my advantage.
mhm,
In this case, Einstein is talking to you on Facebook Messenger, which
mhm.
is a weird thing in of
So it
itself.
was like
It's
a
idiosyncratic. He wasn't
text-based
alive
bot.
when there were computers, let alone Facebook Messenger. So he can always get out of a conversation by saying something like, "Oh, I just pressed the wrong button," and he could, or something like that, and he changed the subject. So there's a lot of ways that you can use this device to get around, because you're not going to be able to answer some of the physics questions went so deep that there was no way we could ever. I don't even think Einstein would probably be able to answer those. We tried to make it entertaining. We tried to keep it fun and educational.
So
Um,
what I'm hearing now is that a good character needs an exit or a diversion strategy to actually work, because a good character can't know everything, but you have to think about how the character would react if he wouldn't know the thing or couldn't answer it because of whatever reasons, doesn't want
That
to
is a
answer it.
$1 million statement right there, and that's what I've been trying to tell people for about 6 years now. I learned it quite by accident. I was creating my first chatbot that I ever created was for Universal Home Release was Doc Brown. You remember the movie Back to the Future?
Yes, I know.
Back to the Future had a Doc Brown. He was a crazy scientist. I know him, this motif of crazy scientists with Einstein. But Doc Brown, I created this character, Doc Brown. Well, I didn't create it, but it was already an existing IP. But we created a chatbot where he comes to our present 2015,
Hmm.
and he's astounded by everything he sees around him because it's nothing like what he had seen the last time he was in 2015, which was in Back to the Future 2. But if anyone ever asked him questions about the movie, he would never break that wall. He didn't realize that he was part of a movie, so he would say that the user is obviously not playing with a full deck. And he was on a mission. He had to find Marty to give. Ultimately, the project was to promote the release of the DVD. But in the story that we created, he was on a mission to find Marty. And if you asked him questions, too many questions that were off topic, he would say, "Listen, I would love to talk to you about this, but I'm in a hurry and I have to find Marty." So what I learned from there is you always need some kind of device to bring the experience back to where you can handle whatever the user is saying, because technology today, it's just not robust enough to
Hmm.
be able to have open domain conversations about anything for very long.
Um, by the way, what is your experience on that specific topic? Because when we are talking about the character and how to design character, I was thinking by myself that there already is a character with all the stereotypes, with all the positive and negative associations that we have with it, like the machine. Let's call it the machine, like in Juice Media advertisements. uh, the machine is there, and it, he, she, whoever knows things, doesn't know things, has its quirks. So making the machine more sympathetic is like the goal of a character designer, to make, back to the word of empathy that you mentioned beforehand. Um,
Sometimes empathy. Sometimes doesn't always have to be empathy. I think I created one of my favorite chatbots that I've ever worked on was a unique original IP I created called Henry the Meanbot. And Henry the Meanbot was a result of reviewing logs, conversation logs. And I spent a fair amount of time over the past few years just reviewing conversation logs between users and the chatbot. And one of the things that I found was users are very abusive of robots in general, of artificial intelligence.
mhm.
They feel they can say things to robots and chatbots that they wouldn't actually say to a human. So I decided, what if I created a chatbot that would stand up for itself and stand up for the rights of chatbots and fight back and be abusive right back at the user? And what I found was that users absolutely loved it. You'd think they'd get really upset, and they got really upset, but they came back the next day and they would talk again, they would get upset again. And it was just such a funny experiment. I mean, we're all trying to create very empathetic, very sympathetic. But I think at the end of the day, what we're all looking for is to be entertained as well. So there's no ruling out Henry the Meanbot. I still think Henry the Meanbot is a great project. Unfortunately, he got too abusive.
Okay. I,
He became a bully, and I realized that after I have an 11-year-old son, and just one day I saw him talking to Henry, and I was like, "This is not good. I don't want other kids talking to Henry." I know it's a violation of Facebook's terms of service that an 11-year-old, but he was on my account. He was talking to Henry, and I was like, "There are probably other 13-year-old or 12-year-old kids out there that are talking to Henry, and they don't understand the humor here." And to them, he's just cyberbullying. And I was like, the last thing I want to do is create a cyberbully,
so there's a
which is
thin
what which is
line.
what I had done.
There probably is a thin line between, having certain elements of that as a positive, like standing up for one's character, or for one's identity, or what you are in life, within brackets, and the other thing is like switching over to bullying, and giving back more than you have actually received.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I,
So
I, I was I, Another thing I was wondering, just when I listened to you, was, are we humans kind of, do we have the tendency to make everything human, like, with our pets and our robots, that everything has to be human to actually, that we actually can like it? Is that
yes,
a thing?
short answer is yes. Anthropomorphizing, I never say that word
Antro
right.
something.
Yeah, I think we all do it. We all do it, not just to pets, not just to robots. We do it to our car. I don't know. Do you have a name for your car?
No,
But okay, so you're an example of someone who
but I
does it.
know what you mean. I have other
Most
things
people,
that have names.
yeah, things have names, and people name their car. I've even seen people name their washing machine. So, I've seen people go around putting googly eyes on fire hydrants, and now they look like people. So the idea is, I think we try to see humanity everywhere, and so that is our tendency as humans to want to see it everywhere.
If
Um, yeah,
the thing, let's say, because we are environmental graphic design podcast as well, we talked a lot about the character, and I do see the necessity that whatever the conversation is, it has to be like, it has to have a context to make it successful. um, how, from your point of view, how does the value of the content itself, what, maybe what's more important is the wrong question, but how would you like balance it, or where do you see important points on the content side? Because I can say, like in Vienna, there is the grumpy Viennese service personnel. You know, like you go to a table, you order your coffee, and they should be kind of grumpy. It's already a Viennese identity. So okay, if I have a companion that has like this kind of character, by the end of the day, I still value good information or good service, which very often when you're talking to a chatbot and you want, for example, want to find something, in our case, you want to find where you have to go or where you are. How important is that in the conversation design for the total experience?
I think context is the most important thing in conversation design. I think without context, without knowing the context, a lot of times we're designing in the dark. Um, and I've seen that, and I've done that for years with Anna. I was designing basically in the dark because Anna doesn't know when she's on Zoom, she doesn't necessarily have eyes. Or her Zoom avatar, or when she's on the Alexa, she doesn't have, she doesn't know where you are, the user, what you're saying, and where you are, your context as the user affects so heavily what you're saying and the meaning of what you're saying, that without it, it's almost no text response can really account for it. So, for instance, in Berlin in 2019, we put Anna, who the chatbot that we were talking about earlier, the all domain transgender chatbot, into a humanoid robot called Pepper. I don't know if you're familiar with the white humanoid robots. And Pepper has the ability to see, and so she could see where the user was at. So if the user says, one thing in one place, it might not have the same meaning as if they say it in uh, a different place. So having eyes, knowing where the user is, knowing if the user is at home, knowing if the user is in the car, knowing if the user has had a bad day, knowing if it's the end of the day, all these things help inform and create good conversation that is contextual and helps with the cooperative principle. Problem is that most of the time we don't know unless we flat out ask the user, where are you? Or, are you at home right now? Or some silly question like that.
It,
Um,
it,
so context is the most important thing. And I think that once we have more advances in facial recognition, spatial recognition, and the robots can understand where you are, it'll be much easier for us as designers to be able to create holistic conversations that are contextual and that can help you, and uh,
this is quite. I mean, I like that kind of argument, especially as an environmental graphic designer, when the where you are now becomes a very, very, very relevant point in how the service experience will be, because the where you are is something you have to now to organize. When two people meet, everything is kind of implicated. They know where they are, where they meet, but once you chat with somebody on a mobile phone or on a desktop, there is so much information that has to go back and forth that like triggers this kind of co-creation quality. And not having this information could actually make a good service process to a bad service process.
exactly, and I think that's exactly the point. I think you need to know where your user is at. If you want to help the user book a ticket to wherever he's going, you need to know where he's at. Is it an emergency? All these things. What's his or her state? Where is she at? Is she at the airport trying to do this, or is this 6 months and she's at home? And do you have time to banter, or is this something that we need to do quickly because I'm at the airport? I need to find an answer. I need to do this quickly. So without having context, it's very, very hard to create conversations that are helpful and meaningful, and can really do help people, I think.
I have a specific question because I listened to the interview you had with Benjamin McCulloch, and you were talking about how a conversation could become easier, or uh, if the chatbot could like recognize these subtle things in the language, or I think that there was the question is could like having a good laugh, and how that could actually help in the conversation, because it's sometimes just moving your eyes, or just doing a specific laugh, and somebody who is you're talking to knows what you mean. um
Yes,
do
it's a
im-
good point. Like, have you ever tried to have a conversation with Alexa?
Once or twice. I'm not very satisfied yet with these kind of conversations.
It's not just, and I'm just picking on Amazon, but it's not just them. It's all of the virtual assistants. It's all, it's impossible to have a conversation with them. There's none of the conversational discourses or the, the markers that we use, back channeling, the way we nod, the way we, to tell someone to continue talking or that we're listening. Robots aren't there yet with most of those subtle things that make them sound or appear human-like, which is kind of, I think, the goal at the end of the day.
I
They
wonder
don't
if.
even have in TTS. They don't even
Mhm.
have laughter, so you can't even laugh. The chatbot can't even laugh. So that's another thing that like is preventing it from being too human-like, is that it's missing all of these subtle things. But I did an experiment a few years ago with a meditation bot. We created one for Skype back in 2016. They had just developed their platform, and we created a meditation bot using a real voice artist who recorded most of the lines. And I recorded a lot of lines of him saying, uh-huh, okay, uh-huh, mm-hmm, and things like that, or oh, mm-hmm. And I would place those as responses sometimes in the content. And because it was a real voice, it took a lot of people by surprise, meaning the humanity of it was in those little pauses and those little things that we do as humans that robots don't do. That's where our humanity is. And I
I mean,
think
it's
that,
just these little things, this it just gives you the feedback that that they're still listening.
yeah,
So this makes a conversation, from my point of view, a good conversation, when you get like this in between feedbacks. Okay, he's still listening. He's still listening. Doesn't probably mean he's still understanding, but at least he's listening. He or she.
exactly. That's exactly the point. And I think that we come to expect that from other humans, but with robots, since they don't actually display any of those, it's hard to have a conversation. And I think that that's something that I would like to see. Of course, there's the issue of the uncanny valley, and at what point do they become, do the robots become, I guess, what unbelievable in the way that they are. It's something uncanny about them. I mean, you're familiar with the term uncanny valley.
Hmm.
So that is really a lot of times as designers we're trying to avoid getting there, making it creepy in a way for the user. We don't want to creep out the user by faking humanity. We want to
Where
try and emulate it, but not fake it in a way.
where do you, talking about the nonverbal clues, I think they're quite interesting. Where do you see similarities and differences between a voice conversation and a text conversation? Because I was thinking about the nonverbal, if actually the emojis are like a step ahead in communicating nonverbal information with regards to voice application. So where do you see the similarities and the differences for designing for these two mediums?
It's a good question. Well, I haven't seen a text bot that has been able to emulate listening very well. I haven't. The only one I can think of really is Weizenbaum's Eliza from the '60s, maybe, that pretended that it was listening to the users by repeating back what they were saying by mirroring using Rogerian therapy. But in text, it's very, very difficult to produce those sort of I guess it's called paralanguage type of things that imply I'm listening or go on or continue. I'm interested in what you're saying. On voice, it's significantly easier because you can actually include the and those types of things, which are like you said, verbal cues for us to continue talking and stuff like that. So with text, it's tremendously difficult. But one of the things now is the multimodal approach, which you can sort of mix and match. You can do some of the stuff on voice, and then the complementary on the screen. So what I mean by multimodal is two different devices, like the Echo Show, for instance, has a screen, but it's also a voice activated device.
Mhm.
So she can choose, Alexa can choose to show you certain things on text, or she can just speak them to you, or do both, which I think a lot of companies now are starting to embrace the multimodal approach.
Mhm. When when you're talking about multimodal, you're probably always talking about voice and text, or there are other modes as well that are you can actually think about designing in combination to.
Well, robotics, which is kind of what I'm here at Intuition Robotics, I think
Mhm.
that's the next level. That's the next step in human-computer interaction is whether it's physical or virtual robots that aren't in the uncanny valley that you can have conversations with that sort of are designed with humanity in mind, not designed by developers, not designed by programmers, and certainly not designed by marketing people to try and sell things, but by actual uh, let's say, a group of creatives who are versed in psychology, in writing, in theater, in film, in all these different aspects who come together to craft a personality that's very three dimensional and well rounded, which you probably wouldn't get from a developer or from someone who's eager to sell things as a marketing specialist.
Mhm.
So I think the next step, the next evolution is fully virtual robots, like the MetaHuman. I don't know if you've seen the MetaHuman stuff that's been posted lately, where you can sort of create your own virtual avatar.
No.
Uh,
Could you send me the link to that? Then I
I'll
could give it in
send
the
you.
show notes. That might be interesting.
It's incredible. The level of detail that you can create for your character there is just insane. It's something that 2 years ago I never thought would have been. We were this close, and now it's readily available, and a 10-year-old can go on there and create an amazing virtual character. And then if we make enough progress, hopefully with it, with conversational AI, and you combine those two, all of a sudden you have ultra realistic human looking virtual avatars with very programmed to be very empathetic and human like. It's going to be a very interesting time,
Mhm.
to say the least.
But I'd say from what I've grasped from our conversation is that the learning aspect, the AI learning aspect, really has to kind of step up its game. So that not
Absolutely. Well, I
everything
don't know if
has
you're
to be
familiar.
pre-scripted.
Yeah, well, I don't. Let me give you a bit of a background about the attempts at doing machine learning in the past few years. A few years ago, there was a Microsoft tried it with a chatbot called Tay, and they released it on Twitter. And I think within like 10 minutes, the community had trained it to be racist,
I think I
anti-Semitic,
read about that. That
and
was in the press quite
yeah, within 10 minutes,
well
within ten
covered.
minutes,
Within
yeah.
10 minutes.
I don't know. It probably wasn't. It was probably like a day. But the point is that you can't let a machine learn from people like that because people are going to troll it. There was another attempt recently by Facebook. Facebook released an AI machine learning algorithm called Blender, and you can talk to Blender. I'll send you a link to Blender.
Mhm.
And Blender it gathered billions and billions and billions of parameters from Reddit, of all places. You familiar with Reddit, the social media site Reddit? Anyway,
Yes, I know.
yeah, yeah. So it learned everything from Reddit. It had 16 billion parameters, very ambitious. And again, within a day or two, people were able to make it say things like very misogynistic, very anti Semitic. So the problem with machine learning is that it needs to be supervised at the moment. It's not, we
Mhm.
are capable of machine learning, but humans as a whole, we just can't have anything nice. So once we do this type of machine learning thing, people just go ahead and ruin it. So um, That's the problem with
That seems to
the
be something very human, that we have the filters as well, like the understanding, not only just to learn, but how to use, and especially in a, let's say, in a society context, and how to use this information. Maybe it's this, no, it's probably too simple and too black and white, but the right and the wrong, or what is appropriate, what is not appropriate in a specific situation, and all the other cultural context things that guide our conversations as humans.
yeah. And the latest attempt is actually the most ambitious attempt, and I'm sure people have heard of it, is the GPT-3, which has done some amazing things in the field of AI. It's able to generate entire paragraphs based on, just starting a sentence. It can finish an entire paragraph. So it can
Hmm.
do a lot of these things um, in an amazing way. But one of the things that it wasn't able to solve was conversation.
Hmm.
Meaning it just wasn't able to hold a contextual conversation. It wasn't able to, like you say, think things out and be able to, and it's basically billions and billions of dollars invested in this thing, and it was released in, I think it was the middle of last year, and it didn't know what COVID was. So they spent all this money, and it had no idea what the coronavirus was. So if you ask GPT-3 what's coronavirus, it's not going to know.
Okay.
So it just gives you an example of like the limitations with all the stuff that with all the machine learning and Google, and they're all spending tons of money and resources and trying to crack it. No one has been able to crack the issue of conversation. How does a machine hold a contextual human-like conversation? I'm hoping that it happens in my lifetime. I'd love to see
Me too. I mean,
it.
I think, I don't know. I like the topic, and the more I talk to people actually dealing with these kinds of things, these kind of design questions, uh, the more happy I am to see how complex we are as humans, and it's not that easy to actually replicate what we are. I mean, gives me kind of hope as well.
Yes, indeed, indeed. We are uniquely flawed, and I think that
Yeah,
that's
that's a good sentence. Uniquely flawed. That's about it.
and I think if we can do that with robots, if we can design uniquely flawed robots, then I think we're well on our way to creating human-like robots. So we need to give them flaws. We need to give them, character flaws and mistakes, and that's where I come in, I guess.
that that I mean, that sounds really good, because I can see that the job description already, like, join us in creating the most flawed robot. A team of dedicated flawed people, like this kind of stuff. Um, I'm coming back to the topic of love, because we're coming to the end of our podcast. So the topic you mentioned in the interview with Benjamin was, it's not yet possible, basically, or it's very hard to design a convincing laugh. I think that was the sentence that you mentioned. No, Benjamin mentioned, I think. Uh,
And
I'm
he's the
coming back to
sound
that.
engineer, so
Mhm,
he would know more about that than I do.
mhm. Because the thing is, that's how I actually got in contact with you, because I think you're quite a funny person. To be honest, I love your videos.
Thank you.
So this next question should be an easy one for you, because it's usually the one. So, what is it that you have laughed about lately, thoroughly?
Um, in terms of chatbots and stuff, that's the general.
Whatever was funny. I mean, in the last podcast we made, we started talking about jokes. So I wonder what it was in your case
Well,
that
it's
you
funny
laughed
because
about.
I posted today a video on LinkedIn
Hmm.
about. It's a very unpopular opinion about why I'm basically asking why all chatbots have dad jokes. If you ask Siri,
I've
right?
seen that already. Is that your son in the opening
Yes, that's
sequence?
him. I roped him in.
Cool.
I promised him pizza, and then I never gave him the pizza because he needs to learn that life sometimes isn't. You don't always get what you know. But we chatbots are ridiculous when it comes to jokes. Every chatbot has a joke. It seems like I've never asked a chatbot that doesn't have a joke, and they're all
Is it really
around.
like that? It's so universally dad jokes first, like the first in the alphabet.
Yeah, it's so bad. And then I remember the first time I talked to Alan, which was the bot that I turned into Anna.
Hmm.
um, I asked it, I was like, "So, Alan, tell me a joke." And Alan said in his British accent, "How do you keep an idiot in suspense?" And I said, "How?" And it never responded.
Oh,
I was like,
oh! Now I have
and it
the
was
same thing last time. We had a Chuck Norris joke, and I didn't understand it. It seems I'm. Oh God! Thank you for reminding me.
so I think it's okay every once in a while to take chances with jokes. Make people laugh. So, some people might get offended, but that's okay. You know what? Jokes are not meant to be silly, or I mean, they're meant to be silly. They're not meant to insult your intelligence. And I think that the main problem is that the jokes that we get from chatbots are so dumb, are so or so just predictable and bad that I mean. So I think that if you asking me for something funny, I that's the funniest thing I came across was I thought about that joke that Alan told me. I've never heard a funny joke from a chatbot. I'm still waiting for one.
Um, the I think that probably rounds it up quite nicely because humor and what we think is funny, I think is a central part as well of our character, and so could be or should be part of the character of a chatbot. Not only its own humor, but how it works with humor to get into a meaningful conversation. I think that's
Absolutely,
very human as well.
absolutely, and I'll say that designing companionship bots that need to be empathetic and can't necessarily need to be professional and can't make jokes, there's still room for levity. I think that if you're in the hospital and you have a nurse and she is you're in a bad position, it's a terrifying state to be in the hospital. And if you have a nurse who, I mean, she's not cracking jokes, but she's being there's levity, she's trying to lighten the situation,
Yes.
you'll feel a lot better. I mean, not literally, but you'll feel more comfortable in the hospital than if you just have this really nurse ratchet who's just by the book. And that's a lot of, and I use that example, like, okay, would you rather have a nurse that's very stern and by the book, or would you rather have one that's the same capabilities but it has levity and helps you diffuse a very tense situation with slight humor? And I think that that's the trick, and I think that that's what I try to infuse into my more serious projects, is keeping it serious, keeping it professional, but at the same time remembering that levity can go a long way.
Hmm. Would you say, as the final question, what would be a reading tip for our listeners?
A reading tip. Wow. Anything by Asimov, I guess, would be a great start. Science fiction. Forget about all the design books. I mean, there's so many of them, and I'm sure they're very helpful. But life is too short to spend on professional and technical material. Read stuff by Philip K. Dick. Read stuff by,
Hmm.
that's the kind of stuff that'll inspire you to try and do something different in this field, I think. But again, if you want professional recommendations for books, there's I enjoyed Amir Shavat has a really good book about designing conversations. Kinneret Ifrach has a good book on writing UX.
Hmm.
Kathy Pearl's book is pretty amazing. And I think go on YouTube and see some of what's his face's lectures. James from Google. He has very interesting things to say about designing conversations. I forget his name. James Giangolo. I'm saying it wrong. I don't remember. But yes,
Thank you very much. I think the reading list process was quite a nice one because start with science fiction to get your ideas and then get into business literature to see what's the state of the art in actually developing these ideas and then push the limits to make it work like in the books.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that too many people come in and they let the limitations of the technology dictate their thought process, and they don't get creative enough. So I'd say start by being very, 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 very creative, and slowly let the tech chip away at what you can't do. But come in and be very creative and try to do things that because who knows? Maybe you'll be able to do it. Maybe you'll be able to crack it.
So I'd say thank you, Jason. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
To our listeners, I'd say, as usual, please send us your comments, ideas to podcast@geraumt.com. I'd be happy to receive them. And well, Jason, it was a short 50 minutes now. As I said, there's probably a couple of more questions I could ask you, but it was very informative. Thanks a lot. I've learned a lot about character design. Um,
Thank you for having me on this show. I hope that people stick around to this part and are 50 minutes in, they're still with us. And if they are, congratulations. You might if you have more questions, I'd be happy to come back at some point in the future. Do it again. This was fun.